Good evening, everyone. I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. It's a pleasure welcoming all of you here live for an in-person event, not simply a Zoom event. And this is a program that has really quite special importance to YIVO in ways that I will describe. But before we get started, I just wanted to ask, how many of you know of the Protocols of Elders of Zion? How many of you have actually read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? Very few. Some. Very good. Not many. And one of the aspects of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is that it is a work that has entered into the mythology of the 20th century, into the mythology of anti-Semitism, and it's almost not even necessary to read it, only to know that it exists. It is amazing how effective a fake can be, observes Michael Hagemeister in the opening pages of the perennial conspiracy theory, Reflections on the History of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a book that is published in English by Routledge Press. Today, perhaps more so than at any time, at least in my lifetime, we live in a world of fakes, which makes the scrutiny of this forgery and fake all the more important. Tonight's program has special meaning for the YIVO community, however, because on the one hand, our speaker for this evening has done perhaps more work than any scholar in the world on tracking down and documenting the authenticity and the history of the document that the historian Norman Cohn has called a warrant for genocide against the Jews. That alone gives tonight's presentation significant value. On the other hand, one of the scholars that was involved in a significant way in the Bern trial that Michael Hagemeister will speak about was none other than Elias Cherikover, one of YIVO's founders, whose archive is now part of our collection and has been completely digitized, by the way. Moreover, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion must again claim our attention because elements of it are incorporated into Article 22 of the Hamas Charter of 1988. Used by the Tsar's secret police, the Nazis, Henry Ford, and the anti-Semitic movement in the United States. The protocols were also used by Stalin's secret police during the time of the Doctor's Plot. This text has been cited by left, by right, by center, by communists, by fascists, by capitalists, and plays a role today in the often violent expressions of anti-Semitism around the globe. We are therefore much in debt to Michael Hagemeister for the extraordinary historical research that he has conducted. Michael Hagemeister is a historian and Slavist. He has published widely on Russian philosophy and intellectual history, apocalyptic and utopian thought, Russian anti-Semitism, neo-fascism, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the life and work of the Russian religious and apocalyptic writer Sergei Nilis, about whom he is in the process of completing a book. He has taught at universities in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. He is currently involved in a research project at the University of Bochum on anti-Western and anti-modern thought in Russia. The perennial conspiracy theory, Reflections on the History of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, is available in English. And with that, I wish to invite Michael to the podium for his talk. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I must start with an apology. My English is far from being perfect, and I have a rather German accent, and it's fairly rusty, but I try to do my best. On the 14th of May, 1935, Judge Walter Meyer made a personal statement before the Bern District Court. I don't want to prophesy. I hope a time will come when nobody will understand why in the year 1935, almost a dozen quite sane and reasonable people racked their brains for 14 days before a Bern court over the authenticity of these so-called protocols, these protocols which, despite all the harm they have caused and may yet cause, are nothing more than ridiculous nonsense. With this, I shall part from the protocol, stating that the protocols are a forgery, they are plagiarism, and they fall under the Article 14 of the law against trash literature. Meyer's statement came at the end of a sensational trial that lasted almost 2 years. In June 1933, Swiss Jewish communities had filed a lawsuit against several members of far-right groups for distributing trash literature, Schundliteratur. In the course of the trial that followed, 17 witnesses were heard and 3 comprehensive expert reports were produced. But what had they argued about so bitterly and with such effort? The trash literature at issue in this trial was a booklet entitled The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. What are these protocols? Published at the beginning of the 20th century and barely noticed at that time, with the beginning of the 1920s, the protocols had been translated into numerous languages and sold millions of copies. They have become the most influential text of modern anti-Semitism and a cornerstone of the Jewish Masonic conspiracy theory. They have spread to all corners of the earth, and their career is far from over. How could this happen? At first glance, the text itself seems unexceptional. An unknown Jewish speaker appears in front of an unidentified audience at an undisclosed location, at an unspecified date, and explains the secret methods and goals of a supposedly centuries-old Jewish conspiracy against the entire non-Jewish world. The protocols begin by revealing the strategies and tactics used by the elite Jewish conspirators to sabotage all spheres of political, social, economic, and cultural life. Nations will be worn down through class struggles, wars, and revolutions, and, quite up to date in times of the corona pandemic, I quote, the spreading of disease. They will be economically ruined by the power of gold and financial manipulation, infected with the poison of liberalism, and morally corrupted by rationalism, materialism, and atheism. Explicit reference is made to the disintegrating effect of Darwinism, Marxism, and Nietzscheanism. Having been reduced to anarchy and poverty in this way, the non-Jews, longing for peace and security, will then finally hand over all power to the Jews of their own free will. Upon the ruins of the old order, the Jewish leaders will then establish a Jewish world empire. It will be a perfectly organized, centralized, and patriarchal dictatorship under a king from the house of David. This world leader is described as a charismatic father figure, a model of virtue, self-command, and reason. Admired by the masses, Jews, both Jews and non-Jews, he's almost idealized. I quote, "The king of the Jews," says the speaker, "must not be at the mercy of his passions. He must sacrifice to his people all personal inclinations." End of quote. A benevolent despot, the Jewish king will rule over a harmonious, united, and pacified world. The new society described in the protocols will be a unified, peaceful, totalitarian welfare state with socialist features. There will be no unemployment, as everyone will have a right, or rather an obligation, to work. The production of articles of luxury will be reduced as they corrupt morals, and drunkenness will be prohibited by law. With the words of the Jewish conspirators, I quote, "We shall prove that we are benefactors who have restored to the rent and mangled earth the true good and also freedom of the person, and therewith we shall enable it to be enjoyed in peace and quiet with proper dignity of relations on the condition, of course, of strict observance of the laws established by us. Our authority will be glorious because it will be all-powerful. Our authority will be the crown of order, and in that is included the whole happiness of man." The goal of the conspiracy, extensively documented in the protocols, is neither open enslavement, nor is it outright destruction, which is threatening the non-Jews. Quite the opposite. The aim of the Jewish conspirators is a new society, a conflict-free realm of reason. These are all quotes. It will be an empire in which the vast majority of the people, described as blind and incapable of ruling, being completely controlled and manipulated, live in dull happiness and peace without having to assume the burden of freedom. In order to establish this empire of peace and security, sacrifices do, of course, have to be made, but, as the speaker declares, the result justifies the means. It is remarkable that the text of the protocols is completely devoid of the old traditional accusations against Jews, such as the murder of Jesus, well poisoning, host desecration, ritual murder, fake conversation, racial pollution, or blood defilement. None of this figures in the protocols. Instead, there is extensive talk of law and order, monopoly on violence, state finance, fiscal policy, national economics, the gold standard, higher education, and mass media, topics which dominate public discourse at the end of the 19th century and are still relevant today. The goal of the Jewish conspirators, as outlined in the protocols, is, as I have said, the establishment of a worldwide totalitarian welfare dictatorship with socialist features. The Jewish king will unite humanity and provide it with an abundance of material goods. For this great service, the non-Jews will worship him as a benefactor. The Jewish conspirators will completely control the mass media, but they will also, and this is particularly clever, set up a seemingly oppositional press, which they will also completely control. One can read into the protocols the fear of a dawning modern totalitarian age, fear of the consequences of industrialization, globalization, and all-encompassing surveillance. The Jewish conspirators then appear as the all-powerful agents of modernity and become the objects of hate for modernity's opponents and losers. It is remarkable how rarely the protocols, with their vision of leader cult, mass propaganda, denunciation, censoring of the press, and aspiration to world domination, has been read as an anticipation of the modern police state and related to the totalitarian systems of the 20th century. This has only happened on a few occasions, for example, in the work of Hannah Arendt, who in her famous The Origins of Totalitarianism points to the, I quote, strangely modern elements and the extraordinary actuality of the protocols. Arendt viewed the protocols as the totalitarian blueprint of a world-spanning Führer-style dictatorship and remarked, I quote, "The Nazis started with a fiction of a conspiracy and modeled themselves, more or less consciously, after the example of the secret society of the Elders of Zion." End of quote. After 1939, the protocols were no longer published in Nazi Germany. Perhaps, as some contemporaries had already suggested, those in power feared a comparison with the methods and goals of rule with those of the alleged Jewish conspirators. As early as 1936, the journalist Alexander Rubinstein had described in a book Hitler as a disciple of the Elders of Zion. The correlations between the elite Jewish methods and modern totalitarian practices become even more striking in the case of the Soviet Union. I give you some quotes from the protocols. "We will create a strongly centralized administration so as to grasp all the social forces in our hands. We shall mechanically regulate by new laws the activities of the political life of our subjects. These laws will eliminate, one after another, all liberties and freedom. Not a single announcement will reach the public without our control. We must not permit the press to make any exposures of public dishonesty. People must be led to believe that the new regime has satisfied everybody so thoroughly that even crime has ceased. We shall erase from the memory of man all facts of previous centuries which are undesirable to us." These are all quotes from the protocols. A far-sighted commentator remarked in this regard, I quote, "The Soviet people, including the Jews, have lived through every bit of this prophecy. In some respects, the Soviet totalitarian state has even surpassed the author's imagination." The protocols were first published in 1903 in an obscure newspaper in St. Petersburg, edited by the anti-Semitic agitator Pavel Khrushchev, about whom historian Stephen Zipperstein recently published an important book. Khrushchev's paper went out of business shortly thereafter. Only a handful of libraries still own copies. The protocols remained unknown outside Russia until after the 1917 revolution. Russian immigrants brought them to Western Europe and to the United States to warn against so-called Judaeo-Bolshevism, where they caused a sensation. The protocols caused a sensation, and not only in right-wing anti-Semitic circles. In January 1920, the first German edition of the protocols appears with the title The Secrets of the Elders of Zion, and towards the end of the year, 6 editions have already sold out. Here you see some of the first publications of the protocols, left the German and then English and French. At the same time, the protocols were translated and published in England, France, Poland, United States, and countless other translations and publications followed. The protocols made a particularly strong impression in England. In May 1920, the Times of London asked, I quote, "What are these protocols? Are they authentic? If so, what malevolent assembly concocted these plans and gloated over their exposition? Are they a forgery? If so, whence comes the uncanny note of prophecy, prophecy in parts fulfilled, in parts far gone in the way of fulfillment?" End of quote. The violent reaction to the protocols and the deep worries the text caused pointed to the need for a rapid clarification of their origins. Relief was therefore widespread when, in August 21, the Times managed to show that large sections of the protocols were a distorted and plagiarized version of a French political pamphlet, Maurice Joly's Dialogue en enfer entre Machiavel et Montesquieu, published anonymously in Brussels in 1864, which was directed against the rule of Napoleon III and had nothing to do with Jews. But who prepared the plagiarism? This question was quickly answered by self-appointed witnesses who claimed to have detailed knowledge of how the manuscript was created. The most important witness is a French count, Alexandre du Chayla, and a story he told in the Paris newspapers in May 1921 was one of conspiracy, a sinister anti-Semitic conspiracy to be exact. The story of du Chayla goes as follows. Toward the end of the 19th century, Pyotr Rachkovsky, head of the foreign agency of the Russian secret police in Paris, notorious Okhrana, orders his assistant Matvey Golovinsky to fabricate an anti-Jewish text. In the Bibliothèque Nationale, Golovinsky concocted what would become the protocols. The French manuscript reached the hands of the Russian author Sergei Nilus, a religious writer with strong apocalyptic tendencies, who translated the text and published it in 1905 as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So much for du Chayla's story. Here you see Sergei Nilus. The opponents of the protocols were delighted, particularly since du Chayla had lived in Russia and had known Sergei Nilus personally. They had met in a Russian monastery in 1909, but this is the only point in du Chayla's story which is true. Here we see young du Chayla and Sergei Nilus sitting on the left. Du Chayla claimed that Nilus had shown him the original French manuscript of the protocols and confessed that he had received it from Rachkovsky. Du Chayla's accounts of the fanatical Nilus, the sinister machinations of the secret police, and the intrigues and conspiracies of the court that had led to the fabrication of the protocols seemed coherent and convincing. Moreover, they were written in such a colorful and compelling manner that du Chaillu soon became the hero of the fight against the forgery and a chief witness to the story of its origin, despite the complete lack of convincing evidence for any element of his story. In 1967, Norman Cohn's Warrant for Genocide was published and became the standard reference work on the protocols. Basically, Cohn did no independent research, preferring to compile the findings of others. Du Chaillu's conspiracy story then appears in key passages of Cohn's book, providing the facts that still strongly shape the narrative of the protocol's origins. As compelling and effective as it is, there is little doubt that this narrative contributed to the myth surrounding the protocols and to their success. Not only the scientific literature has accepted du Chaillu's story, but also Umberto Eco in his novels Foucault's Pendulum and the Prague Cemetery, and American cartoonist Will Eisner took du Chaillu's story as the basis for his graphic novel about the protocols. We see here the Russian secret agents in Paris as they, according to du Chaillu, prepare the forgery of the protocols. And this is how Eisner imagines Sergei Nilus. The image, must say, contains, however, 5 errors. Nilus was neither a mystic, nor was he invited to court, nor did he conduct seances, nor was he a competitor to Rasputin, and finally the protocols were first published not in 1905, but 1903. Du Chaillu and his version of the origins of the protocols from Rachkovsky's forgery workshop in Paris also played a central role in the already mentioned sensational trial against the disseminators of the protocols, which took place in Bern from 1933 to 1935. The nominal charge was against the sale of trash literature, Schundliteratur. The primary aim, however, was not to punish the Swiss Nazis who were on trial, but to uncover the origin of the protocols and to reach a verdict in which expertise, witnesses, and documents demonstrated that the protocols were a forgery. It was hoped that providing the protocols to be a forgery would be a decisive victory over the ongoing anti-Semitic campaigns throughout Europe, particularly in Nazi Germany. The lawyers for the plaintiffs who tried to expose the protocols as a forgery were not themselves specialists on these matters, and they turned for help to experts by using their extensive connections to Jewish and anti-fascist organizations. In Amsterdam, Alfred Wiener, founder of the Jewish Central Information Office, supplied the plaintiffs with rare books, and the Lenin Library, in response to my inquiries, denied to have ever owned it. Outside the Soviet Union, a search for information was launched by Ilya Cherikova, famous Jewish historian living in Paris at that time, author of a book on pogroms in Ukraine during the Russian Civil War, and, as you know, one of the founders of the Institute for Jewish Research at that time in Vilna, and by Boris Nikolaevsky, another prominent historian and archivist of the Russian revolutionary movement. We see them here in front in Bern, in front of the courthouse. Cherikova's extensive correspondence, which provides a detailed insight into his activities during the Bern trial, is spread across several archives: the Institute for Jewish Research, the Bach-Metje Archive, Columbia University, Hoover Institution, Stanford, the Archive of Contemporary History in Zurich, Switzerland, and the Wiener Collection in Tel Aviv. Preparing my book on the Bern trial, I worked in 30 archives in 10 countries. Cherikova contacted several important Russian historians and former political figures, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who were all living in Paris. Among them was Vladimir Burtsev, both an archivist and historian of the Russian Revolutionary Movement, who had become famous by exposing a great number of agents provocateurs. Other witnesses included Genrich Slosberg, a lawyer and Jewish activist, and Pavel Milyukov, former leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, who first published Du Chaillat's story in 1921. All informants worked for honoraria, only for obtaining the Russian documents. A sum of up to 10,000 Swiss francs had been provided. Honoraria played a role in securing not only their testimony, but their active participation in the search for the truth about the protocols. The formula devised by Cherikova to finesse the issue of honoraria, potentially delicate since it could be used by Nazi propaganda, was that he was collecting contributions for a volume of papers and documents on the protocols. This work, for which he asked the Swiss plaintiffs for the sum of 25,000 French francs, never materialized, and it's unclear whether Cherikova ever intended to complete it. During the main hearings in October 1934 and April-May 1935, the Russian emigres from Paris appeared at the trial as expert witnesses. The plaintiffs' carefully planned strategy was clear: a detailed, coherent, and persuasive narrative about the origins and early disseminations of the protocols should prove their character as a fabricated and anti-Semitic concoction. The publicity surrounding the court proceedings would ensure that the message reached a wide audience. The plaintiffs based their guidelines for the witnesses' statements on Du Chaillat's version that the protocols originated from Rachkovsky's Paris forgery workshop. This version was used despite increasing internal doubts about the integrity of this witness and the truth of his tale. Boris Nikolaevsky, for example, one of the coordinators on the side of the plaintiffs and an expert on the Tsarist secret police, admitted in a confidential letter that he had come to the conclusion that Rachkovsky, I quote, at no point in his career had or could have had anything to do with the preparation of the protocols. He, Nikolaevsky, called Du Chaillat an impostor and a swindler who had no idea about the origins of the protocols. Nevertheless, Nikolaevsky did not present his findings at the trial since, as he wrote later, this, I quote, would have been a stab in the back of the Russian experts and would have played a considerable role in damaging the campaign against Hitler, end of quote. Du Chaillat, who appeared in Bern as prime witness, he described himself as the only real witness. I'm the only one who has seen anything, was primarily interested in financial gain. Even his sensational accounts of the origins of the protocols written in 1921 had been produced for a fee. Now he negotiated stubbornly, as we learn from the correspondence, with the representatives of the Jewish plaintiffs to force up the price. He demanded and ultimately received 4,000 Swiss francs to turn up at the trials, a sum which took a great deal of effort for the plaintiffs to raise. What the plaintiffs did not know, in Russia, du Chaillu had outed himself as a fierce anti-Semite who himself believed in conspiracy theories. In 1913, during the notorious blood libel trial against Mendel Baylis in Kiev, du Chaillu had worked as a journalist. In his articles, du Chaillu had supported the blood accusation and called on the secret leaders of the Jewish nation to repent. The personality of du Chaillu is still shrouded in mystery. In the 1930s, he lived near Paris. After the occupation of France, his personal papers were confiscated by the Germans. Later, they fell into the hands of the Red Army, were brought to Moscow and hidden in a secret archive, where I detected them in 1993. Now they are in the archive of the Russian Secret Service and inaccessible. Let us now turn to the defendants who felt forced to prove the authenticity of the protocols were supported by Ulrich Fleischhauer, founder and head of the private anti-Semitic propaganda and news agency Weltdienst, World Service. This agency, based in Erfurt, Germany, was dedicated to, I quote, the solution of the Jewish question and the dissemination of the protocols. Fleischhauer, retired colonel of the German army, was himself no specialist on the protocols, but he was able to rely on a far-reaching network which had been established in the early 1920s in order to combat Jewish Judaeo-Bolshevism. This conspirational Antisemitic International united German völkisch circles, Italian fascists, Russian monarchists, and French conspiracy theories. Their connections stretched from Berlin and Budapest to Los Angeles and to Harbin in Manchuria. Secret meetings were arranged, manifestos and programs were written, and organizational structures were set up. Throughout the trial, representatives of this Antisemitic International were keen to avoid the spotlight, but were all the more active for it behind the scenes. Fleischhauer was a victim of his own conspirational obsessions. He decided to counter the underground Jewish international with an Aryan international of anti-Semitism, which was equally as conspirational as the imagined enemy. It operated with code names and addresses and sought to create an international network of opposition to Jews. Fleischhauer's Weltdienst had a certain sect-like character, and its international activities were being watched with increasing suspicion by Germany's Gestapo and security service. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda had initially promised Fleischhauer its support during the Bern trial, but withdrew it following an internal report that questioned the authenticity of the protocols. Fleischhauer, who was not a member of the Nazi Party, repeatedly lamented the lack of open support from the National Socialist State. One of Fleischhauer's most important assistants was Boris Tödli, a Swiss fascist and anti-Semite, born in Russia, who became the European representative of the All-Russian Fascist Party based in Harbin, Manchuria. Here we see Tödli in a homemade Nazi uniform with borrowed medals. This is from the large file of Tödli's correspondence on the activities of Russian fascists during the interwar period, which is now in the Swiss Federal Archives in Bern. I mention this also to point out that there are still many documents that shed light on the transnational anti-Semitic movements in the interwar period, a broad field for future research. The proceedings at the Bern trial, a district court, lasted more than a year and a half and attracted international media attention. By far the majority of Swiss and international news publications declared outright support for the Jewish plaintiffs. Their strategy to prove the origins of the protocols had been a resounding success. On the 14th of May 1935, Judge Walter Meyer ruled that the text was a forgery and a work of plagiarism, and that its distribution violated the law on trash literature. 2 of the 5 defendants accused of distributing the protocols were fined 20 and 50 Swiss francs, respectively. The plaintiffs hailed the verdict as a victory in the campaign against Nazi anti-Semitism, describing the trial as the most significant defensive battle in the history of Switzerland's Jewish communities. The German Nazis did not seem too disturbed by all this. Even before the trial was over, the völkischer Beobachter declared categorically that the verdict was completely irrelevant. No court decision could stop the course of history. The final verdict would be decided by history. Quote, trials that anticipate a historical decision are inevitably lost by the judiciary. In November 1937, the Bern Court of Appeal overturned the former judgment. It ruled that the protocol were a malicious attempt to defame the Jewish people and that they were indeed trash literature in the aesthetic sense, but not as defined by the law which prohibited, I quote, circulating text, songs, and images which might incite an instrument to commit a crime, endanger morals, gravely offend one's sense of decency, or exert a brutalizing influence, end of quote. The question of authenticity, the question whether the protocols were a genuine document or a forgery and a work of plagiarism was thus deemed irrelevant. Dissemination of the protocols was not a criminal offense. The defendants were acquitted, and the costs of both trial, more than 30,000 Swiss francs, were deduced from state coffers. Both sides claimed victory. I'm coming to the end. The Bern trial leaves an ambivalent impression. At first glance, the plaintiffs' immediate goal was achieved, namely to have an impartial court establish that the protocols were fake and that there was no Jewish world conspiracy. However, the narrative with which the Jewish plaintiffs attempted to uncover the origins of the protocols was a dubious construction based on equally dubious witnesses, a fact that at least some of those involved were aware of. However, as we know today, the historical proof of the forgery and a court judgment confirming this also proved to be ineffective weapons in the fight against the protocols, as these measures were based on the erroneous assumption that anti-Semitism could be fought with facts. The Bern trial thus also shows the limits of the judiciary in defending against ideologically motivated attacks. So the protocols still live on. Thank you for your patience. Oh, yeah.
Please. Thank you so much. We're going to open the evening to questions from the audience, and Julia has a microphone. So if you have questions, please do flag down Julia, and she will pass the microphone to you. Thank you.
What can you say to the argument that the Bern trial was not really a legal fight, but a tactical fight by the Jewish community to combat anti-Semitism in Switzerland and to relegate Nazism as an enemy of Swiss people? And even though the Swiss were themselves quite anti-Semitic, their sense of righteousness and fair play eventually inured them from Nazism, and in many ways protected the Jewish community throughout the Second World War.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting to see how, in the course of the more than 1.5 years, and the preparations last much longer, how the opinion of the Jewish community changed, because this court trial was extremely expensive. Who has to pay for it? And there was in the Swiss press an increasing opposition. Why should we finance the Jews this process? We have no interest in it. And the Jewish community got aware of it. And when it came to this appeal process, should we continue with it? No, let it be. The atmosphere is turning against us. And and then the sum, 30,000 francs, were taken from state covers. So, not the right wing, but the Swiss patriots, they said, no, why what does it care us? Why should we finance these things? So I got the impression that, they wouldn't continue with another thing was, at the same time in Basel, there was also a trial going on, and this was based on, how to say that in English? Beleidigung, offense. It was a personal offense, and the question was, can a single Jew be offended by the protocols, and can he? The question was of is there a kind of collective offense? Can a single Jew said the protocols are offending not only to me, but on the whole Jewish community? And this is a question which was, at that time, there was no legal possibility to, there was, sorry, I'm, okay.
If I could intervene for a second, though, but this raises the question of how successful a legal defense against a belief system can be, because the protocols did not impose a belief system. The protocols came out of a belief system that pre-existed. And so I'd like your thoughts about that.
Yeah, you have to believe in the Jewish world conspiracy, and then you can point to the protocols and say, oh, well, there we have the physical proof that this conspiracy, there we have the program. I met anti-Semites, I mean, the first time I encountered the protocols was in Russia in the late 1980s, early 90s. I met people who asked me about protocols, and I realized they believe in the world Jewish conspiracy. I asked them, did you read the protocols? No, it's not necessary, but there's the plan. It's enough to know that there's a plan, but never read the protocols, it's not necessary. So first you believe in this kind of conspiracy, and then you can point to the protocol. The other way round, that you get agitated by this rather sometimes dull, sometimes primitive, sometimes very clever text, these passages which are based on Joly's text. Well, try it. Try to read the protocols, these 60, 80 pages. And how do you feel then? I mean, I feel I have to go to the open air and get my head clear. I cannot imagine that you feel agitated. Sometimes a bit polemically, I say the only thing that the Russian muzhik during the Civil War, when the protocols were distributed, it was that the Jews forbid alcoholism. Yeah, okay, this is clear. But all these other very difficult passages about finance and the press and things, I don't think it's a real agitating text. It's too complicated, and it's too dull at long passages. Mm-hmm. So I wonder how this works. It's probably much more the paratexts. It's the introduction. It's the comments. The protocols are usually being published with long introductions. And it's these introductions, especially the German edition, it's these introduction which is really aggressive and which is an agitating text, but not the protocols itself. So.
Yes.
As the world's oldest hatred, anti-Semitism has a long, violent, descriptive, political, economic, social, and religious history. Having said that, could we also step away from Hannah Arendt's statement and view the protocols not just as a blueprint, but as a template for all the political systems that have arisen as a result of World War I, with the treaties of Locarno and Versailles that punished Germany, that practically destroyed it and forced its disarmament, as well as resulting in totalitarian governments, communism, fascism, which in and of themselves are actual mirrors of what the protocols supposedly state. What amazes me, and I would wonder what your take on this is, why do these totalitarian governments and leaders don't see themselves as copying the protocols? Their thinking is not original.
Is that's your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that the Nazis needed the protocols as a blueprint for what they would. For me, the protocols is, which is amazing, it's a very early anti-utopia in the sense of George Orwell. It contains all these totalitarian features of the 20th century. It's an anticipation of a lot of things we encountered then in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. But I don't think that any of these modern totalitarian systems were inspired by the protocols. But it fits, and maybe this is also an explanation why the protocols can be read as, if you believe in a Jewish world conspiration, as a blueprint of Jewish Bolshevism.
So that was what I wanted to ask you about, because I'm not sure everyone knows exactly what that connection is and how powerful that was and how important that was also to Henry Ford and the growth of anti-Semitism in the United States. So if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe also a little bit about this mysterious figure, Leslie Fry.
Yeah, the famous quotation by Henry Ford is, the protocols fit in what is going on. So they fit in. It's no question whether they are authentic. He wasn't interested so much in the authenticity, but they are true. They are true. And just was the same, some Russians said, well, just have a look at the history of our country in the 20th century. It was all written in the protocols. So they fit in, the protocols. And Henry Ford, and you mentioned Leslie Fry, a very interesting figure, American from California, who was married to a Russian officer and spent some time in Russia, was fluent in Russian, came back to the States, settled down in California, and established a network of anti-Bolsheviks and anti-Semites, part of this Antisemitic International, and she had a lot of contacts to Germany and Switzerland and even to Manchuria. So Ford, who was also interested in the origins of the protocols, he financed her, Leslie Fry, in the mid-1920s to do research and to go to Soviet Russia, which she did. She spoke Russian. And to find out Sergei Nilus. She was successful in that. But Nilus didn't want to talk to her. No, it was Nilus, he died in 1929 in Soviet Russia. But yeah, and then Leslie Fry, she continued her work. She died in 1970, in California, and still has a lot of friends and admirers, and her many publications about conspiracy and Bolshevism and Jews. They are still being reprinted and are still accessible, and especially on the web. I think there is a lot of research to be done to shed light on these. I was amazed when I went to the archives and was always the first to go through these correspondences of these anti-Semites throughout the world in the interwar period. A lot to be still to be done.
We have a little more time. Anyone else?
Professor, in the last chapter of your book, you mentioned the Third Temple and the Third Rome. What are your thoughts? And so we have two Russian scholars here. What are your thoughts now on the effect of Nilos and the growth of this anti-Semitic mood in present-day Russian intellectual circles, and how it may be influencing the present situation in Russia and in Ukraine today?
What was the question?
The question is the influence of the protocols on present-day Russian anti-Semitism.
Okay. Yeah, okay, sorry. I have high-tech in my ear, but I'm still orally handicapped. So excuse me if I ask to repeat your question. Well, I encountered the protocols, as I said, in the late 1980s in Russia. I had heard in Germany that these protocols didn't get interested, never met anybody who talked about the protocols. They don't play any role in present-day Germany. But in Russia, it was different. And at the late 1980s, the protocols weren't accessible at that time. People, intellectuals, philosophers, church people, they asked me about the protocols. My answer was, why waste your time reading such a stuff? I myself hadn't read the protocols. But then the protocols in the time of perestroika in the early 90s, they were sold at every street corner and were discussed in the press, and these fascist Pamyat people distributed the protocols. This was the high time, I would say, of when the protocols were easily accessible. For 5 kopecks, you could get a copy of the protocols. And but now, in present-day Russia, and my wife and I, we went to Moscow every year until the pandemic started. So in 2019, the last time we went to Moscow, I would say no, it's over. It's over. It's the protocols. There are small circles probably, but you cannot buy them on the street, and they are nearly not mentioned even in the right-wing and extreme right-wing press. And such people as the leading conspiracy theorist in present-day Russia, Alexander Dugin, you may have heard his name, he doesn't believe in the protocols, and he believes in conspiracies, yes, of course, and also Jewish conspiracies, but he himself is not anti-Semite. Some of his allies are Orthodox Jews. He is a traditionalist, and every traditionalist and extreme traditionalists are his potential allies in the fight against Western liberalism, Western democracy, globalism. So this is interesting. He is not a, so to say, classic. Also, he deeply believes in conspiracies, and he has written a book called Conspirologia on conspiracy theory. So it's much more difficult now. The high time of the protocols were the 1990s in Russia.
The copy of the protocols that I have, I bought in the gift shop of the Kremlin in, I think, 1993.
Yeah, there was even I have in my collection of the protocols some dozens of editions, and there's also an edition also from the early 1990s in Russia issued by the PLO. So, no wonder.
The copy that I have, however, has a little prefatory note by none other than Henry Ford, translated into Russian. Yes. We have time for one more question.
I just had a question. I think you did you mention something in reference to the Hamas or Hezbollah and the protocols? Yeah, I wanted you to clarify, I guess, in terms of what role, if that's being distributed in the Arab community in Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas, and how they view the protocols, and whether that's a factor in, you know, I guess, more anti-Semitism in the Arab community.
The Hamas?
Yes.
Yeah, and we also received this question online as well, where we have over 200 people watching in our online audience. And they were also wondering if you could speak a bit more about the Arabic translations of the protocols. Yeah,
well, as far as I know, I'm not an expert on Hamas, but in the recent charter of Hamas, the protocols are no longer mentioned. It was the charter of the 1988.
Yes.
There the protocols are mentioned, but there is, as far as I know, but I'm not an expert on that, and modernized...
The current, if I may, the current the current text, in fact, makes a point of not superseding the 1988 charter. So it's not exactly that it has been removed, it's just not being spoken about in the current charter of Hamas.
I'm not an expert on these issues. I'm a historian specialized on Russian history, and therefore I was interested in the Russian origins, or probably Russian origins, of the protocols and the early dissemination and reception in Russia. That's my expertise. Everything else is, I have to rely on other experts.
However, those of you both here in the audience and also watching on live streaming, you should know that on April 16th at 1 p.m., we're going to have a webinar program on responses to October 7th that will feature Jeffrey Herf, Mayor Litvak, Norman Goda, Karen Stegner, as well as David Hirsch, where this subject is surely going to be addressed more fully. So maybe that's it for this evening. I want to encourage everyone to do more research, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you for your patience.